Tonight, we're drifting back into that world, a place famous for elegance, refinement, and beauty so carefully crafted that it became legendary. But like most legends, it looks very different up close.
Because behind the powdered faces and sweet-smelling rooms was a daily routine that was less glamorous than history usually admits. French royalty didn't chase beauty the way we do now. There were no quick showers, no simple skincare routines, no fresh-smelling soaps waiting by the sink.
Beauty was a performance, layered carefully on top of habits that modern noses and sensibilities would struggle to understand. And the more important you were, the more uncomfortable that performance often became. This isn't a story meant to shock you awake. It's a slow walk through candlelit chambers, whispered court gossip, and strange rituals repeated day after day, simply because everyone agreed that this was how beauty worked. Some of these routines were harmless, others were deeply misguided. Most were accepted without question, because questioning tradition at court could be far more dangerous than a little discomfort. As we move through this story, you'll notice a pattern. When something felt unpleasant, the solution was rarely to remove it. Instead, it was covered, masked, powdered, or perfumed. Cleanliness was suggested, not required. Freshness was implied, not confirmed. And appearance mattered far more than comfort. So settle in. Let the lights dim a little. Let the details drift by without trying to hold on to all of them. This is the kind of history you don't need to memorize, only to listen to. The kind that hums quietly in the background while your thoughts slow down and the world outside feels far away. If you enjoy calm stories like this, stories that move gently through the stranger corners of the past, you might want to stay with Boring Owl. It's a place for unhurried history, soft narration, and topics that don't demand your full attention, only your curiosity. Tonight, we'll begin with something simple, not jewels or gowns or grand banquets, but the most basic question of all. How did French royalty actually stay clean? Or, more importantly, how did they avoid doing so, while still convincing the world they were flawless? And from there, everything else begins to make sense. The idea of cleanliness in royal France was not what we would recognize today. In fact, if you walked through a palace expecting the faint echo of soap and water, you would be quietly disappointed. For French royalty, especially between the late medieval period and the height of Versailles, water was not a friend, it was a threat, something to be treated with caution, suspicion, and a fair amount of fear. The belief was simple and deeply ingrained. Water, they thought, opened the pores. Open pores invited illness. Illness led to weakness, and weakness had no place at court. This idea wasn't limited to the uneducated or superstitious. Physicians, scholars, and trusted advisors repeated it often enough that it became truth. A bath was not refreshing. A bath was risky. A bath could quite literally kill you, or so they believed. So instead of daily washing, French royalty practiced avoidance. Full-body bathing was rare, sometimes happening only a handful of times in a lifetime. Kings proudly recorded their baths as noteworthy events, as if they were military victories rather than moments of basic hygiene. Queens followed similar routines, carefully limiting their contact with water and trusting that elegance could be maintained through other means. When water was used, it was done cautiously. Hands might be rinsed, the face occasionally wiped. Even then, it was often with a damp cloth rather than immersion. Linen played a starring role in this system. Clean undergarments were believed to absorb impurities from the body. If you changed your linen frequently, you were, in theory, cleansing yourself without the dangers of water. This belief was comforting, convenient,
and entirely wrong, but it allowed royalty to feel virtuous without altering their habits.
Palaces were filled with fresh shirts, chemises, and shifts, all layered beneath heavy outer garments. Servants worked tirelessly to change and launder these items, reinforcing the illusion of cleanliness. The body itself, however, remained largely untouched. Dirt was something that migrated outward, not something that needed to be scrubbed away. Or at least that's what everyone agreed to believe. There was also the practical matter of plumbing, or rather the lack of it. Palaces were architectural marvels, but they were not designed for easy washing. Heating large quantities of water required labor, time, and resources. Draining it afterward was another problem entirely. Even for royalty, bathing was an inconvenience. Avoiding it felt sensible, even refined. Smell, of course, was unavoidable. Bodies do what bodies do, regardless of status. Instead of addressing the source, French royalty focused on distraction. A pleasant environment, they reasoned, could overpower any unpleasant reality. Windows were opened when possible. Flowers were arranged generously. Herbs were scattered in rooms and sewn into clothing. If something smelled faintly off, it was considered normal. If it smelled strongly off, it was considered a failure of decor, not hygiene. Court life reinforced this normalization. When everyone smells roughly the same, no one smells bad. Standards adjust quietly and collectively. What might have been unbearable to an outsider became background noise to those who lived within it. Over time, the human nose adapts. What once seemed alarming fades into the ordinary, especially when surrounded by silk, gold, and authority. There was also an element of pride involved. Enduring discomfort was seen as a mark of strength and discipline. If peasants bathed in rivers and streams, then avoiding water became another subtle way for the elite to distinguish themselves. Cleanliness through abstinence was oddly enough a status symbol. The less you needed to wash, the more refined you appeared. Medical advice supported this mindset. Doctors warned against soaking the body, particularly in warm water. They believed it weakened the heart, softened the flesh, and disrupted the delicate balance of humors within the body. Cold water was equally suspect, thought to shock the system and invite chills that could spiral into serious illness. In this worldview, staying dry was staying alive. Children born into royalty learned these rules early. Bathing was introduced cautiously, then gradually discouraged. Parents were praised for limiting their children's exposure to water, believing they were protecting fragile bodies from unseen dangers. Clean linen, fresh air, and controlled environments were considered sufficient. By adulthood, the idea of regular bathing felt unnecessary at best, reckless at worst. This fear of water didn't exist in isolation. It shaped everything that followed. If you couldn't wash your body properly, you had to find other ways to manage appearance. Skin tone, texture, and smell all required creative solutions. Beauty, under these conditions, became an elaborate workaround rather than a natural state. Royal faces were rarely bare. Even before cosmetics entered the picture, the skin was protected with layers of fabric, hats, and veils. Sun exposure was avoided to maintain a pale complexion, which signaled privilege and leisure. Sweat was inconvenient, but accepted. After all, sweating meant your body was expelling impurities, something doctors approved of far more than washing them away. Occasionally, a royal would attempt something closer to a bath, but these moments were surrounded by ritual and reassurance. Herbal infusions were added to the water to make it safer. The temperature was carefully controlled, the duration was short, and afterward, the event was discussed, analyzed, and sometimes criticized. One wrong outcome could reinforce fears for decades. Stories circulated at court about people who bathed too often and fell ill soon after. Whether coincidence or imagination, these tales carried weight. They were repeated in hushed voices, passed from servant to noble, from noble to monarch.
Over time, they became cautionary legends, discouraging anyone from straying too far from accepted practice. As a result, cleanliness became more about appearances than reality. A clean room mattered more than a clean skin. A fresh outfit mattered more than fresh skin. The goal was not purity, but plausibility. You didn't need to be clean, you just needed to look like someone who didn't need cleaning.
And as we move forward, you'll see how this avoidance of water didn't simply influence royal habits. It quietly shaped an entire culture of beauty, built on concealment, denial, and the shared agreement not to look too closely beneath the surface. Once water was quietly removed from daily life, something had to take its place. You can only avoid washing for so long before the body begins to leave evidence of itself. Skin dulls, color deepens unevenly. Small imperfections appear and linger. In the world of French royalty, none of this could be allowed to show. Appearance was not personal, it was political. This is where powder entered the story, not as decoration, but as a solution. White powder became the great equalizer of the court. It smoothed over reality, softened harsh lines, and turned living skin into something closer to marble. A pale face suggested leisure, refinement, and separation from labor. It implied that you spent your days indoors, far from the sun and the dust. Darkness of skin was associated with work, exposure, and the lower classes. Whiteness, even if entirely artificial, was power. The process of applying powder was slow and methodical. Faces were prepared with grease or ointment to help the powder stick. This alone added weight and warmth to the skin, but it was necessary. Without it, the powder would fall away, revealing the very reality it was meant to hide. Servants assisted with the application, using soft pads or brushes, building layer upon layer until the skin beneath disappeared. Powder didn't stop at the face. Necks, shoulders, and even hands were often coated to maintain consistency. Any visible patch of untreated skin risked ruining the illusion. The goal was not subtle enhancement, it was transformation. The body was being edited in real time, reshaped into something closer to the court's ideal. Once applied, the powder was rarely removed completely. At the end of the day, it might be lightly wiped or brushed, but thorough cleaning was avoided for the same reasons bathing was. Over time, layers accumulated. Fresh powder was added on top of old powder, which sat atop oils, sweat, and the remnants of previous days. The surface looked calm. Beneath it, things were far less orderly. The ingredients themselves were rarely questioned. If something produced the desired effect, it was embraced. Many powders contained substances meant to brighten and preserve the pale look for as long as possible. They worked well, at least visually. The skin appeared smooth and uniform, almost unreal. Under candlelight, it was striking. Under scrutiny, it told a more complicated story. Wearing powder was uncomfortable. It tightened as it settled, limiting facial movement. Smiling too widely could crack it. Laughing too hard risked visible lines forming where the mask began to fail. Royals learned to move their faces carefully, not out of vanity alone, but practicality. Controlled expressions weren't just elegant, they preserved appearances. Heat made everything worse. Candles burned constantly in palaces, warming rooms that were already crowded. Powder absorbed moisture, turning heavy and uneven. Sweat couldn't escape easily, trapped beneath layers of grease and chalky covering. Instead of being wiped away, it was ignored. Adjusting one's appearance too often suggested insecurity. Confidence, even false confidence, was more valuable than comfort. Despite this, powder was non-negotiable. Appearing without it was unthinkable in public. A bare face suggested illness, poverty, or moral failing. Even private audiences often required a powdered appearance. Beauty was not something you turned off, it was a constant obligation.
There was also a psychological comfort to powder. It created distance between the person and the world, between the body and its natural functions. Once the mask was on, you became the version of yourself that court expected. The tiredness, the irritation, the quiet discomfort underneath no longer mattered. What mattered was the surface. This obsession with pale skin had consequences beyond individual routines. It shaped how health was perceived. Redness, blemishes, or uneven color were treated as flaws to be concealed rather than signs to be understood. Instead of asking why the skin reacted a certain way, the response was always to cover it more thoroughly next time. Over time, certain looks became fashionable. Some favored a soft, velvety finish. Others preferred an almost blinding whiteness that bordered on theatrical. Fashion at court moved quickly, and makeup followed. Royals adapted, layering more or less powder depending on what was admired that season. Comfort was never part of the calculation. Servants played a crucial role in maintaining these appearances. They prepared the powders, mixed the bases, and ensured consistency. A mistake could be humiliating. Uneven application, visible buildup, or discoloration could invite whispers. In a place where reputation was currency, those whispers mattered. Powder also had a way of migrating. It settled into clothing, furniture, and bedding. Chairs bore faint outlines of powdered wigs and shoulders. Bedsheets carried residue from faces pressed into pillows. The palace itself absorbed these habits, becoming a quiet archive of daily rituals. Removing powder completely was rare and often delayed. The idea was to disturb the skin as little as possible. Scrubbing was avoided, gentle wiping was preferred. Any irritation that followed was seen as unfortunate but acceptable. After all, beauty demanded endurance. As these routines became normalized, something subtle happened. The face you presented to the world no longer felt temporary. It became familiar. The powdered version of yourself began to feel more real than the person beneath it. Natural skin, when occasionally glimpsed, looked strange by comparison, almost unfinished. This shift mattered. It made extreme practices easier to accept. If your real face felt incomplete, then adding more layers, stronger mixtures, or longer-lasting solutions seemed logical. Each adjustment promised greater control over an unpredictable body. And so, the reliance on powder grew heavier with time. It solved immediate problems while quietly creating new ones. The face remained pale, composed, and admired, but beneath that calm surface, the skin was being asked to endure far more than it was ever meant to handle. As we continue, the question becomes less about how powder made royalty look and more about what it did to them over time. Because when beauty becomes a barrier between the body and the world, something has to give eventually. At first, the body tried to cooperate. Skin is remarkably patient. It tolerates heat, pressure, and neglect for longer than most people realize. In the early days of heavy cosmetic use at the French court, many believed they had found a perfect balance. The powders worked, the routines were familiar, the mirror reflected what society demanded. For a while, it seemed like the system held. But skin remembers everything. Day after day, layers were applied and only partially removed. Grease settled into pores. Powder clung to moisture and oil. Natural shedding slowed beneath the weight of it all. The surface looked smooth, but underneath, the skin struggled to breathe, to renew itself, to do the quiet work it had always done without permission. Small changes appeared first. Tightness that lingered long after application. Dry patches that refused to soften. Redness that came and went without explanation. None of this was alarming on its own. Discomfort was expected. Court life was uncomfortable by design. A little irritation was simply another price paid for privilege. Instead of stepping back, the response was almost always to add more. If skin looked uneven, it was powdered more thoroughly. If redness showed through, the mixture was adjusted. If cracking appeared, heavier ointments were applied beneath the powder to smooth things over. Each solution focused on appearance, not cause. The goal was always to restore the mask. Over time, faces changed in subtle but lasting ways. Skin lost its natural elasticity. Lines appeared earlier than expected, not from age, but strain. The constant cycle of coverage and concealment created a fragile surface, easily upset by heat, movement, or time. When something went wrong, it often did so suddenly and publicly. A cracked cheek at court was more than a cosmetic issue. It was a breach, an invitation for whispers, proof that the illusion was vulnerable. Royals learned to guard their faces carefully, not just from judgment, but from themselves. Smiling too widely, frowning too deeply, even speaking too energetically could threaten the delicate balance. The idea of healthy skin barely existed in the modern sense. What mattered was controlled skin, predictable skin, a surface that could be managed and maintained. Pain, irritation, and sensitivity were treated as inconveniences rather than warnings. Hairlines suffered quietly alongside faces. Powders and pomades didn't stop at the forehead. They settled into the roots, mixing with oils and sweat. Natural hair growth slowed, weakened, or changed texture over time. Hair became brittle, more prone to breakage. The solution, again, was not care, but concealment. This fed directly into the growing dependence on wigs, which we'll return to soon. But even before wigs fully dominated fashion, natural hair was already being quietly abandoned. It was unpredictable, difficult to manage, a liability in a world that demanded consistency above all else. Medical understanding offered little relief. Physicians observed the symptoms but interpreted them through the lens of humors and imbalance. Irritation was seen as excess heat. Dryness was blamed on internal cold. Treatments focused on adjusting the body's imagined inner state, not removing the external stressors causing the problem. Ironically, these treatments often made things worse. Ointments intended to soothe added more weight to the skin. Lotions meant to cool trapped moisture beneath powder. Every attempt to fix the damage became another layer in the cycle. There was also a cultural resistance to acknowledging harm. Admitting that beauty practices were damaging meant admitting that the court itself might be wrong. That was unthinkable. It was easier to frame discomfort as personal weakness. If someone reacted badly, it was their body that failed, not the system. This mindset kept routines intact long after evidence suggested they were harmful. Royals prided themselves on endurance. If something hurt, it meant it was working. If something caused discomfort, it meant sacrifice. Beauty, after all, was never meant to be easy. As the years passed, some faces became almost unrecognizable without their cosmetic armor. Natural skin tone was rarely seen, even in private. The idea of appearing bare felt more unsettling than the irritation itself. Without the familiar weight of powder, the face felt exposed, unfinished, almost indecent. This psychological dependence mattered just as much as the physical one. When your reflection only feels correct after a ritual, that ritual becomes essential. The line between enhancement and necessity disappears. Occasionally, someone would attempt to change, a brief reduction in powder, a lighter application. The results were rarely encouraging. Skin, long deprived of air and balance, reacted poorly. Redness flared, texture shifted. The experiment was quickly abandoned, reinforcing the belief that the old ways were best. The court environment amplified everything. Heat, candles, crowded rooms, and long hours made already stressed skin work harder. Sweat had nowhere to go. Movement was restricted. Even blinking felt deliberate under thick layers. Still, appearances were maintained. And yet, beneath all this effort, the body kept signaling that something wasn't right. It just wasn't being listened to. By the time many realized the long-term effects, they were deeply invested. Too invested to stop. Too accustomed to the mask to imagine life without it. The face became a project, one that required constant attention and escalating commitment. This gradual damage set the stage for more extreme solutions. If natural skin could no longer be trusted, it had to be replaced, disguised, or ignored entirely. Wigs, perfumes, and elaborate rituals weren't trends born of vanity alone. They were adaptations. Because once beauty becomes a battle against the body eventually loses. By the time natural hair began to feel like a liability rather than an asset, the transition to wigs felt almost inevitable. Hair, like skin, was unpredictable. It reacted to heat, age, stress, and the very products meant to control it. For French royalty, unpredictability was unacceptable. Power demanded consistency, and consistency required something that could be adjusted, replaced, and perfected at will. Wigs offered that control. At first, wigs were practical. They concealed thinning hair, uneven growth, and the damage caused by years of powders and pomades. They allowed a royal to appear unchanged over time, even as the body beneath quietly aged. But practicality quickly turned into fashion. Once wigs entered the court, they didn't just solve problems, they created new standards. Hair no longer needed to grow. It didn't need to be cut or shaped with care. It only needed to be hidden. The wig became the public face of one's appearance, while natural hair retreated into private irrelevance. Some shaved their heads entirely to make wigs sit better and feel lighter. Others kept their natural hair cropped short, treated as a foundation rather than a feature. Wigs were impressive objects. Made from human hair, animal hair, or a combination of both, they were styled into elaborate shapes that defied gravity and logic. Curls were stacked, powdered, and fixed into place. Height mattered. Volume mattered. A larger wig suggested confidence, influence, and wealth. The court noticed these things, even if no one said them aloud. Maintenance was constant. Wigs had to be cleaned, reshaped, and repowdered regularly. This work was not done by the wearer. Specialized servants handled it with practiced precision. A well-kept wig reflected not just personal taste, but the efficiency of one's household. A poorly maintained one suggested neglect or dwindling resources. Despite their elegance, wigs were not comfortable. They trapped heat. They pressed against the scalp. They shifted with movement, requiring subtle adjustments throughout the day. Wearing one for hours at a time demanded patience and restraint. Removing it, however, was rarely an option until the day's duties were complete. Once a wig was in place, it became part of the performance. Gestures adapted, movements slowed. Turning one's head too quickly risked disturbance. Royals learned to carry themselves with deliberate grace, not solely for aesthetics, but practicality. The body was accommodating the object, not the other way around. Natural hair beneath the wig received minimal attention. It was hidden, forgotten, and often neglected. Washing was rare. Trimming was irregular. The focus remained on the visible layer. If something went wrong underneath, it was out of sight and therefore out of mind. Over time, wigs grew more elaborate. What began as concealment evolved into exaggeration. Styles competed for attention. Height increased. Decorations appeared. Feathers, ribbons, and ornaments transformed hair into architecture. The head became a display, a statement that could be admired from across a crowded room. This escalation came with consequences. The more complex the wig, the more demanding the maintenance. Powder was applied generously to maintain uniform color and texture. Once again, powder solved immediate visual problems while quietly creating others. It settled into the fibers of the wig, clinging stubbornly between cleanings. Wigs were not worn once and set aside. They were reused, passed between occasions, sometimes shared. Cleaning methods varied, and standards were inconsistent. What mattered most was appearance, not what lingered unseen. If a wig looked acceptable, it was considered acceptable. The storage of wigs was another overlooked detail. They were kept on stands, in boxes, or on shelves, often near sources of warmth. These spaces were not sterile. They were part of the palace environment, with all its dust, fabric, and constant human presence. Over time, wigs absorbed the atmosphere around them. Despite this, wigs remained essential. They were symbols of status, power, and adherence to court norms. To appear without one was to appear incomplete, even vulnerable. Natural hair, once a sign of youth and vitality, became something to be hidden, a reminder of the body's limitations. The psychological shift was profound. When hair becomes something you wear rather than grow, it changes how you relate to yourself. Identity moves outward, attaching itself to objects rather than flesh. The wig you chose mattered more than the hair you had. Removing a wig at the end of the day was not always a relief. Without it, the head felt strangely exposed. The familiar weight was gone. The reflection in the mirror no longer matched the image carried through the day. For some, this contrast was unsettling. As wigs dominated fashion, tolerance for inconvenience increased. Discomfort became background noise. If something itched, it was ignored. If something pressed too tightly, posture adjusted. The expectation was endurance, not comfort. This culture of endurance blurred important lines. When discomfort is constant, it stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling normal. That normalization would soon extend beyond pressure and heat into far less pleasant territory, though few at the time were willing to admit it. Because when something is worn daily, stored imperfectly, and maintained under less than ideal conditions, it doesn't stay pristine for long. And while wigs offered control over appearance, they also introduced new variables that were much harder to manage. As we move forward, the focus shifts from what wigs promised to what they quietly carried with them, hidden beneath curls, powder, and the unspoken agreement not to look too closely. At first, no one wanted to notice.
Wigs were admired from a distance, praised for their height, symmetry, and careful styling. Up close, attention stayed politely on the surface. Court etiquette taught people where not to look, and wigs quickly became one of those places. They were personal, expensive, and essential. Questioning them meant questioning the entire performance. But daily wear has consequences, even when wrapped in silk and powdered to perfection. Wigs were worn for hours, sometimes from early morning audiences to late evening gatherings. Heat built slowly beneath them. The scalp, already neglected, produced oil and moisture as it always had. Powder settled into this environment, mixing with sweat and residue from previous days. The wig sat on top of it all, heavy and unmoving. Cleaning was irregular. Some wigs were brushed and aired frequently. Others were only refreshed when their appearance visibly declined. Full washing was avoided because it damaged the structure, loosened curls, and ruined careful styling. Water, once again, was treated as an enemy rather than a solution. Instead, maintenance focused on disguise. Fresh powder was added. Scented oils were lightly applied. Any sign of wear was softened, blurred, or concealed. The goal was always presentation, never inspection. Storage conditions did little to help. When not worn, wigs rested on stands or were placed in boxes lined with fabric. These spaces were warm, dark, and undisturbed for long stretches of time. They were part of living quarters filled with textiles, human movement, and constant activity. Perfectly ordinary environments, but far from pristine. Because wigs were valuable, they were rarely discarded. A well-made piece could be worn for years, altered as styles changed. Hair could be restyled, repowdered, reshaped. Longevity was praised. The idea that something might need replacing for reasons other than fashion felt wasteful, even indulgent. Sharing also occurred more often than later generations might expect. Wigs could be borrowed, gifted, or passed down, especially within households. Servants handled many of these exchanges, managing collections and ensuring that appearances were maintained across multiple people and occasions. All of this created conditions where small, unnoticed problems could grow quietly. Discomfort was the first sign, an itch that lingered longer than usual, a sensation of movement when nothing appeared to be moving. These feelings were rarely mentioned aloud. Complaining suggested fragility. Royals were expected to endure minor annoyances without comment.
If irritation became obvious, it was usually blamed on heat or stress. Court life was exhausting. Long days, heavy clothing, crowded rooms. There were always acceptable explanations that didn't involve questioning wigs themselves. When problems became harder to ignore, solutions stayed superficial. Powders were adjusted, oils were changed. The wig might be removed slightly earlier in the evening, then placed back on the next day without much thought. Temporary relief was enough to avoid deeper examination. The cultural reluctance to look closely mattered. Acknowledging what might be happening beneath the surface meant confronting the idea that refinement had limits, that luxury did not guarantee comfort, that control was, in some ways, an illusion. Servants often noticed more than they said. They handled wigs daily, saw them before powder was refreshed and perfume reapplied. But speaking openly carried risk. Drawing attention to unpleasant details could be interpreted as criticism. Silence was safer. Over time, tolerance increased. Sensations that once would have been alarming became familiar. The body adapted, not because conditions improved, but because it had no choice. What began as occasional discomfort faded into background awareness, easily ignored during conversation, ceremony, and performance. This normalization was powerful. When something is constant, it stops standing out. The mind adjusts expectations downward, accepting what once would have been unacceptable. At court, where routine was rigid and appearance was everything, this adjustment happened quickly. Wigs continued to grow larger and more elaborate, despite the burden they placed on the wearer. Fashion didn't slow down for practicality. If anything, complexity became a virtue. The more difficult something was to maintain, the more impressive it appeared when done well. This escalation widened the gap between appearance and reality. The public image remained flawless, even as the private experience grew more uncomfortable. The distance between the two was rarely acknowledged.
And yet, the system persisted because it worked where it mattered most. From across the room, under candlelight, framed by silk and lace, the illusion held. The court saw elegance, not inconvenience, power, not discomfort. The irony is that these unseen problems didn't just affect individuals, they influenced behavior. Posture stiffened, movement slowed, interactions became more measured. Everything adapted to accommodate what sat atop the head. Wigs, meant to simplify appearance, ended up reshaping daily life. They demanded attention, patience, and endurance. They turned the head into a structure that needed protection, preservation, and careful handling. As long as the surface remained convincing, few were willing to question what lay beneath. That reluctance allowed habits to continue unchecked, reinforcing the belief that elegance required sacrifice, and sacrifice, once normalized, didn't need explanation. But the longer something is ignored, the more power it gains. And while wigs concealed many things, they could not hide the fact that beauty routines built on avoidance and disguise tend to accumulate problems rather than resolve them. Problems that, sooner or later, demand attention, whether the court is ready for it or not. By the time wigs and powder became unavoidable, smell became the next quiet problem that needed managing. Not discussing, not fixing, just managing. Bodies exist whether history likes to admit it or not, and when bathing is rare and layers are constant, scent does not politely stay in the background. French royalty did not think of smell the way we do now. It wasn't automatically tied to cleanliness or morality. Smell was simply another fact of life, something that could be shaped, redirected, or overwhelmed. And if it could be overwhelmed, then it didn't really need to be solved. Perfume became the solution of choice. At first, fragrance was subtle. Light floral waters, gentle herbal notes, mild infusions used sparingly. These early scents were meant to freshen the air rather than dominate it. They were applied to gloves, handkerchiefs, and clothing, creating a soft personal atmosphere rather than a loud statement. But as time passed and routines stayed the same, subtlety stopped working.
Heavier garments trapped heat. Powder and wigs absorbed odors. Rooms filled with people layered in fabric and expectation became warm quickly. A light fragrance could not compete with reality for long. So perfume grew stronger, richer, and far more generous in its application. Scents were dabbed behind the ears, along the neck and onto the chest. They were rubbed into gloves and sleeves. Some were even applied directly to wigs, where they lingered long after the wearer had left the room. The goal was not just to smell pleasant, but to create a cloud strong enough to distract from anything beneath it. Royal living spaces followed the same logic. Rooms were scented constantly. Bowls of dried flowers, herbs, and spiced mixtures sat in corners and along windowsills. Curtains and furniture absorbed these smells over time, layering scent upon scent until the palace itself carried a distinct presence. This saturation was intentional. If everything smelled like perfume, then nothing smelled wrong. Perfume was also comforting. In a world where so much felt rigid and controlled, scent offered emotional reassurance. Familiar fragrances signaled stability, luxury, and belonging. Walking into a room that smelled like roses or amber felt reassuring, even if the reason for that reassurance went unexamined. Certain scents became associated with status. Exotic ingredients suggested wealth and access. Floral notes suggested delicacy and refinement. Musks and resins implied depth and authority. Choosing a scent was not just personal preference, it was social communication. Applying perfume became part of daily ritual, performed with the same seriousness as dressing or powdering the face. It was another layer of armor, another way to present the correct version of oneself to the world. But perfume does not erase odor, it interacts with it. As scents mixed with the natural smells of bodies, clothing, and wigs, they created something new, sometimes pleasant, sometimes overwhelming, often simply accepted. The expectation was not freshness, but consistency. A familiar smell, even if heavy, was preferable to unpredictability. There was also the matter of tolerance. Just as the nose adjusted to the palace environment, it adjusted to perfume. Scents that once felt strong faded into the background with daily exposure. To achieve the same effect, more was needed, stronger blends, heavier application. What began as enhancement became necessity. Medical advice supported this trend in its own way. Doctors believed certain scents could protect against illness. Pleasant smells were thought to purify the air, warding off unseen dangers. Perfume was not just aesthetic, it was preventative. A scented person was a safer person, at least in theory. This belief encouraged even more generous use. If fragrance protected health, then restraint seemed unnecessary. Better to smell strongly than risk exposure to something unseen. Clothing absorbed these practices fully. Fabrics soaked up oils and perfumes, holding on to them between wears. Washing garments thoroughly was difficult and infrequent, especially for delicate materials. Instead, they were aired, brushed, and re-scented. Each cycle added another layer. The result was a kind of olfactory echo. Yesterday's perfume mingled with today's application. Over time, garments developed a permanent identity, recognizable before the wearer even entered the room. This was not considered unpleasant. It was familiarity. Personal scent became part of reputation. Certain royals were known for their fragrance choices, just as others were known for their wigs or gowns. A recognizable scent could announce someone's presence before they were seen. In a crowded court, this was power. Of course, there were limits. When perfume failed to fully distract, the response was rarely to reduce use, it was to change the blend. Stronger notes replaced lighter ones, earthy scents replaced floral ones. Adaptation continued without questioning the system itself. This constant layering created a strange intimacy between person and perfume. The scent became part of identity. masking not just physical realities but emotional ones as well. Fragrance soothed anxiety, reinforced status, and offered a sense of control in an environment where control was always contested. Removing perfume at the end of the day was rare. Like powder and wigs, it lingered. Bedding absorbed it. Night garments carried it. Even in private moments, the scented version of oneself remained. Over time, natural scent became unfamiliar. When it occasionally appeared, it felt wrong, unfinished, even unsettling. Perfume was no longer decoration, it was baseline. This reliance deepened the disconnect between body and appearance. Instead of responding to physical needs, routines focused on maintaining the illusion. The body adapted by enduring, the mind adapted by accepting. Perfume also blurred boundaries between people. In close quarters, scents mingled. Rooms developed shared identities. Individual presence softened into collective atmosphere. Privacy, already limited, became even more abstract. And yet this system worked in the way that mattered most. It preserved the image of elegance. It allowed court life to continue without uncomfortable conversations. It maintained the fiction that beauty was effortless, even when it clearly was not. As with every solution built on avoidance, perfume solved one problem while quietly amplifying others. It masked reality so effectively that addressing it felt unnecessary, even improper. But masking is not neutral. It shapes behavior, expectation, and tolerance. It teaches people what to ignore and what to prioritize. And as we move forward, we'll see how this focus on covering symptoms rather than causes extended beyond scent and appearance, reaching into how royalty treated even the most personal aspects of daily life, always choosing presentation over comfort and illusion over understanding. If the face, hair, and scent were carefully managed, there was still one place where control was far more limited: the mouth. Smiles were powerful at court. They conveyed charm, authority, and approval. A well-timed smile could soften tension or seal an alliance. But maintaining that smile was far more complicated than history's portraits suggest. Dental care in royal France was not neglected out of laziness, it was misunderstood. Sugar had become a quiet symbol of wealth. Only the rich could afford it regularly, and French royalty enjoyed it without restraint. Sugared fruits, pastries, candied nuts, and sweetened drinks appeared at meals and celebrations. Consuming sugar wasn't just indulgence, it was display. The ability to eat what others could not was its own form of power. What sugar did to teeth, however, was not fully understood. Discomfort was accepted. Toothaches were endured. Loss was normalized. These were considered unfortunate but inevitable aspects of life, especially among the elite who could afford rich diets. Cleaning the mouth was inconsistent and largely symbolic. Some used cloths to wipe their teeth, others relied on powders or herbal mixtures meant to freshen breath rather than remove buildup. Rinsing with wine or flavored water was common. These practices focused on sensation, not prevention. A bright, modern smile was not the goal. Teeth were expected to age, darken, and wear. As long as pain was manageable and speech remained clear, the situation was considered acceptable. Severe discomfort was addressed when it could no longer be ignored, not before. Breath mattered more than teeth. A pleasant scent suggested refinement and self-control. Once again, perfume extended its reach. Scented lozenges, herbs, and spiced mixtures were used to mask unpleasant odors. Breath, like the body, was something to be managed through fragrance. There was little privacy around these matters. Court life meant constant observation. Royals were rarely alone, even during moments of discomfort. Complaints were restrained. Endurance was admired. Drawing attention to pain suggested weakness. When dental problems worsened, the solutions were direct and final. Preservation was not the priority. Relief was. Removing a problem tooth was seen as practical, even if it altered appearance. A missing tooth was preferable to ongoing pain. This approach shaped expectations. Smiles became more controlled, lips kept closer together. Expressiveness adapted to reality. Portraits reflect this subtle restraint, even when idealized. Faces were composed not just for elegance, but practicality. Tooth loss was not hidden in the same way other physical realities were. It was accepted quietly, especially with age. Royals did not expect perfection, they expected functionality. Yet even here, appearance still mattered. When possible, efforts were made to maintain balance. Darkened teeth were not necessarily shameful, but obvious gaps could draw attention. This led to early forms of cosmetic adjustment, designed to restore the impression of fullness rather than health. Speech and laughter became more measured over time. Public joy was expressed carefully. This wasn't always conscious, it was adaptation. The body learned what movements felt safe. Medical advice offered limited guidance. Tooth pain was attributed to imbalances, poor digestion, or internal heat. Treatments focused on soothing symptoms rather than addressing causes. As with skin and hair, the root problem remained untouched. Despite this, court life moved forward. Meals were still lavish, sweets were still celebrated. The system did not adjust to the body adjusted to the system. There was also a strange form of equality in this discomfort. Everyone at court dealt with similar issues. When something is universal, it loses its stigma. Pain becomes background noise, woven into daily life. This normalization reinforced earlier patterns. If something hurt, it was endured. If something degraded, it was masked or accepted. Intervention came late, not early. The mouth, like the face, became another place where appearance and reality drifted apart. Speech remained polished, compliments were exchanged, smiles were offered when expected. Beneath that performance, comfort was secondary. Over time, this acceptance shaped how royalty related to their own bodies. Sensation became something to tolerate rather than listen to. Signals were ignored until they became impossible to dismiss. This pattern extended beyond physical routines. It influenced emotional expression as well. Just as pain was contained behind polite smiles, frustration and exhaustion were hidden behind ceremony and grace. The result was a culture of restraint, not just in movement, but in acknowledgement. Problems existed, but they were rarely named. Solutions existed, but they were often avoided if they disrupted appearance or routine. As with every other aspect of royal beauty, dental care followed the same quiet rule. Do not disrupt the image. Do not question the system. Endure, adjust, and move on. And as we continue, we'll see how this approach to the body didn't stop at daily maintenance. It extended into how royalty faced aging itself, always trying to preserve the illusion of timelessness even as time left its marks in places no powder or perfume could fully conceal. Aging was the one opponent French royalty could never truly defeat, only delay, disguise, and quietly resent. Youth carried power at court. It suggested vitality, fertility, relevance. To appear young was to appear useful, and usefulness was everything. As years passed, the pressure to hold on to that image did not ease, it intensified. Wrinkles were not seen as natural milestones. They were treated as errors, signs that something had slipped, that control was weakening. The response was never acceptance, it was intervention. Faces that had already endured years of powder, grease, and neglect were now asked to do even more. Creams, salves, and pastes promised softness, smoothness, renewal.
These mixtures were applied carefully, often at night, sometimes layered beneath powder during the day. Their purpose was simple: slow time, or at least make it look that way. Ingredients were chosen for effect, not understanding. If something tightened the skin, it was considered effective. If it smoothed texture temporarily, it was praised. Long-term impact rarely entered the conversation. The goal was immediate improvement, visible under candlelight. These treatments often tingled, tightened, or warmed the skin. Sensation was interpreted as success. A lack of sensation suggested weakness. Discomfort became proof that something was happening, that time was being challenged rather than passively accepted. Eyes received special attention. They betrayed age quickly. Fine lines, shadows, and heaviness altered expression in ways that no amount of posture could fully hide. Ointments were dabbed carefully around them. Masks were applied. Rest was encouraged in theory, though rarely achieved in practice. Hands, too, became a focus. They were visible during greetings, gestures, and formal interactions. Gloves concealed much, but not always everything. When gloves came off, hands were expected to match the rest of the illusion. Creams softened them, powders lightened them, jewelry distracted from what could not be erased. Aging was especially fraught for women at court, though men were not immune. For women, youth was tied closely to influence and security. Attention shifted quickly. Favor followed novelty. Remaining visible meant remaining desirable, and desirability was defined narrowly. This pressure shaped daily routines. Sleep was irregular, meals were heavy, stress was constant. None of this supported longevity, but appearance demanded effort regardless of consequence. The body paid the price quietly. Medical voices offered mixed messages. Some encouraged moderation. Others promoted treatments meant to rebalance internal forces believed to cause aging. Very few suggested changing lifestyle or habits in meaningful ways. That would have required challenging the structure of court life itself. Instead, aging was framed as something to be managed externally. Cover, smooth, distract, maintain the surface, and the deeper changes would somehow matter less. There was also fear attached to visible aging. Wrinkles suggested decline. Decline suggested vulnerability. Vulnerability invited replacement. At court, being perceived as replaceable was dangerous. This fear made extreme routines easier to justify. If a treatment promised even a small delay, it was worth trying. If a ritual required time, money, or discomfort, it was still preferable to appearing outdated. Some treatments were cyclical, applied daily or weekly. Others were reserved for special occasions, moments when appearance mattered most. The rhythm of these routines became ingrained, as familiar as dressing or eating. Removing these layers, even temporarily, felt risky. Without them, the face looked tired, altered, too real. Mirrors became less about reflection and more about reassurance. The goal was not recognition, but confirmation that the illusion still held. As with all court habits, these practices spread through imitation. What one influential figure did, others followed. If a queen favored a particular routine, it gained legitimacy. Questioning it became unnecessary, even inappropriate. The cumulative effect was exhaustion, not always visible, but deeply felt. Maintaining youth required constant vigilance. Every morning was a test, every evening an assessment. Was the illusion still convincing? Had time gained ground? And yet, stopping was not an option. To stop trying was to admit defeat. It was to accept aging openly, something court culture was not prepared to allow. This created a strange contradiction. Aging was feared, but inevitable. Effort increased as success became less likely. The body resisted quietly, growing more sensitive, more reactive. Treatments that once worked began to fail. The response was escalation. This escalation didn't just affect appearance, it shaped behavior. Movements became more controlled, expressions more restrained. Energy was conserved where possible, not for health, but for presentation. There was also a growing gap between private and public self.
In private moments, fatigue showed. Skin felt raw, joints ached. In public, the performance continued uninterrupted. The difference between the two became exhausting to maintain. This disconnect fed into earlier patterns. Just as smell was masked rather than addressed, just as skin was covered rather than cared for, aging was disguised rather than understood. The system remained consistent, even as its effectiveness declined. Time, unlike scent or blemishes, could not be fully overwhelmed. It left marks in posture, voice, and stamina. These were harder to conceal. As a result, attention shifted toward managing perception. Appear composed, appear controlled, appear unchanged. The court rewarded this effort. Those who maintained appearances retained influence longer. Those who did not faded quietly. This reinforcement ensured that routines continued, even when they no longer served the body. By this stage, beauty rituals were no longer about enhancement, they were about preservation. Holding ground, delaying the inevitable by days, months, or years. And as we move forward, it becomes clear that these pressures did not exist in isolation. They were part of a larger system that treated beauty not as self-expression, but as obligation. A duty performed daily, regardless of cost. Because at the French court, beauty was never just about looking good, it was about staying relevant in a world that rarely forgave those who appeared to be running out of time. By the time aging began to make itself more obvious, the body's natural rhythms were already working against the court's ideal. Sleep, once a necessity for health, had become a luxury carefully rationed around appearances. Palaces were bustling long after sunset, candles burning late into the night, voices echoing down corridors. Privacy was rare, and interrupted rest even rarer. Royals learned to sleep in segments, resting only enough to maintain outward composure. Lack of proper rest had consequences. Eyes became heavy and reddened, skin lost resilience, and muscles stiffened. The body signaled fatigue constantly, but in the court's philosophy, signals were to be ignored. Appearance mattered more than reality. A brief nap or a hidden yawn was tolerated, but prolonged exposure to the signs of weariness could invite scrutiny or ridicule. Cosmetic routines adapted to these pressures. Powders were refreshed more frequently to combat dullness. Face creams promised brightness after sleepless nights. Perfumes masked not just odor, but the faint scent of stress and exertion. The body was dressed, layered, and masked, always performing, even when the person beneath was exhausted. Meals, too, reflected this ongoing balancing act. Food was rich and plentiful, celebrating abundance, status, and indulgence, yet it often worked against physical health. Sugar, flour, and fats were consumed lavishly to signify privilege, not wellness. The effects were noticeable. Energy fluctuated, digestion struggled, and yet the emphasis on presentation remained absolute. No one wanted the public to see the cost of their lifestyle. Meanwhile, social obligations demanded constant readiness. Audiences, ceremonies, and inspections required a body and face that looked composed, energetic, and most importantly, flawless. Royals became masters of pacing, conserving energy where possible, adjusting posture, controlling facial expressions, and timing movements with meticulous care. Every gesture was a calculated display of vigor, masking fatigue beneath layers of powder, perfume, and finely styled wigs. Even in moments of private reflection, the rituals persisted. Nightly routines were long and meticulous, ensuring that tomorrow's appearance would not betray the body's limitations. Creams were applied with precision, wigs were carefully adjusted and powdered, fragrance was reapplied. The goal was consistency. The illusion had to survive every hour of the day, including moments when no one else was watching. There was a growing psychological effect. Royals began to identify themselves more with their outward presentation than their inner experience. The mask became part of identity. The powdered face, the styled wig, the scented garments, they were not just tools, they were extensions of self. Any imperfection beneath them was seen as a failure, even if it was beyond control. This mindset influenced decision-making. Discomfort was endured silently. Pain was ignored until it could no longer be dismissed. Minor health issues were tolerated as long as appearances were maintained. A toothache, a tension headache, a strained muscle, all were background noise beneath the louder priority of presentation.
Even rituals designed to soothe or improve health were framed around appearance. Sleep, when it occurred, was measured not by restfulness but by how refreshed it made the face look. Meals were structured to avoid visible bloating or pallor. Exercise, if any, was gentle and cosmetic, designed to preserve posture and elegance rather than fitness or strength. This relentless prioritization of how the body looked rather than how it felt had consequences that extended beyond the individual. Court life reinforced these behaviors. Observers learned to read subtle signals of endurance and control, rewarding those who masked strain effectively and penalizing those who could not. Social standing was intertwined with how convincingly one could perform vitality. By this stage, the human body was treated less as a living organism and more as a display object. Needs were secondary to appearances, and adaptation became survival. Those who mastered the system maintained influence, while those who faltered quietly faded. And yet, for all the effort, reality always lingered beneath the surface. Fatigue, wear, and imperfection could never be fully masked. The tension between appearance and truth defined the daily life of the court. Every day was a performance, a negotiation between what the body demanded and what society expected. As we move forward, we will see how this obsession with masking natural processes, skin, hair, scent, aging, and fatigue, culminated in extreme rituals and solutions. Practices that, while maintaining the illusion of perfection, increasingly demanded endurance, compromise, and a near-total subjugation of the body's reality to the court's relentless standards. By the time fatigue, aging, and cosmetic rituals reached their peak, a new problem quietly dominated life at court: the body's most basic processes. Even when everything else was controlled, face, hair, scent, posture, there were realities that could not be ignored entirely. Digestion, sweating, and other natural functions continued, defying etiquette and appearance. Managing them became an unspoken art, as essential as powdering the face or styling a wig. Chamber pots and discreet arrangements were part of daily routines, but privacy was a luxury rarely afforded. Servants and attendants were constantly present, ensuring that needs were met without disrupting appearances. Royals learned to schedule, ration, and even suppress natural urges when protocol demanded. The body became something to be directed with discipline rather than obeyed freely. Even minor discomfort had social consequences. Shifting in a chair, adjusting a garment, or glancing away could betray strain. Court eyes were trained to notice everything, from subtle grimaces to hesitant gestures. This pressure reinforced earlier lessons: endure, adapt, and never let reality break the illusion. The same philosophy applied to illness. Minor ailments were concealed with ointments, powders, and carefully staged behavior. Fever, fatigue, or nausea could be disguised with color-correcting powders, lighter gestures, or perfumes strong enough to overpower even the faintest indication of distress. Doctors offered advice, but remedies were often as theatrical as preventative as they were medical. The emphasis remained on what others could see. Food and drink became extensions of these routines. Meals were designed to be lavish, signaling wealth and refinement, but they also needed to be manageable in public. Courses were rich and indulgent, but swallowing gracefully and avoiding digestive disturbance required skill. Royals learned to eat for spectacle as much as for sustenance, balancing enjoyment with control.
This careful management of bodily functions extended into clothing. Corsets, layers of fabric, stiff petticoats, and heavy gowns restricted movement and altered natural posture. They served multiple purposes, enhancing appearance, maintaining social norms, and, ironically, constraining the body to reduce signs of discomfort. Each layer was both disguise and discipline, transforming the body into a carefully orchestrated display. Perfume, powders, and wigs masked reality, but they could not entirely erase physical signs of strain. Eyes might droop despite concealing creams. Lips might dry despite ointments. Hands might show subtle trembling under gloves. The wearer learned to adapt, moving deliberately, resting subtly, and employing micro-adjustments to maintain the illusion of perfection.
Sleep remained fragmented. Fatigue accumulated, and the body's resilience weakened. Yet the culture rewarded only those who managed appearances effectively. Public perception mattered more than private well-being. Endurance became the ultimate marker of refinement, and the line between discipline and suffering blurred. Even small moments of relief were carefully timed. Baths, when permitted, were brief and meticulously controlled. Gentle washes of hands or faces happened quietly, never disrupting the broader visual narrative. Any deviation from established routines risked exposure of imperfection. In many ways, the body became a performance in itself. Every muscle, every gesture, every glance was directed toward maintaining a standard that existed primarily in the eyes of others. Pain, fatigue, and discomfort were backgrounded, hidden beneath layers of fabric, powder, and fragrance. This relentless control reinforced a central theme. Beauty was never just appearance. It was endurance, discipline, and a near total subordination of natural processes to social expectation. What one saw at court, the powdered face, the towering wig, the controlled gestures, was only the tip of an intricate system of management and suppression. By the end of these routines, the body was transformed into a carefully maintained illusion. The real, living self existed beneath layers of adaptation, largely unseen, quietly strained, and endlessly performing. And it was within this tension, between reality and appearance, between comfort and protocol, that the so-called disgusting beauty of French royalty truly revealed itself. Here, at the intersection of endurance and display, we see the culmination of centuries of ritualized care, concealment, and obsession. Every cream, every powder, every perfume, every wig had a purpose, but that purpose was rarely self-serving. It existed to project perfection, even as the cost was paid quietly by the living body. By the time the body had endured years of powder, wigs, perfumes, creams, and controlled routines, the effects were no longer subtle. The body and its caretaker had developed a complicated partnership, one part endurance, one part suppression, one part ritualized illusion. Every system, skin, hair, breath, posture, digestion, had been coaxed, masked, or restrained to create the image the court demanded. Yet the most insidious effect was not visible at first. It was psychological. When your entire existence revolves around maintaining appearances, the mind begins to entwine with the mask. Royals came to define themselves through reflection and observation rather than sensation. What they saw in mirrors, what others perceived, became more real than the subtle signals of their own bodies. Discomfort was ignored, fatigue was backgrounded, even pain became an abstract concept, tolerated in the name of elegance. This attachment to appearance transformed daily life into constant vigilance. Hours were spent monitoring reflection, adjusting powder, repositioning wigs, reapplying fragrance. Every movement was calculated to minimize disruption of carefully maintained layers. The body became a stage, each gesture a performance. In public, there was no room for error. In private, there was little relief.
The rituals themselves evolved into forms of endurance. Cleaning the face, brushing and powdering wigs, applying perfumes and creams, these were no longer simple tasks. They were obligations, repeated multiple times daily, performed with precision and discipline. The smallest lapse could become a visible flaw, an invitation for judgment, a crack in the carefully constructed illusion. Social hierarchy reinforced these behaviors. To falter in appearance was not merely personal, it was political. Influence, favor, and reputation depended on maintaining composure. A royal who showed signs of neglect or fatigue risked whispers, snickers, and subtle loss of status. Survival at court was intertwined with the ability to perform perfection relentlessly. Even intimate relationships were affected. Displays of affection, conversation, and leisure were filtered through the lens of image management. Interactions were governed by subtle calculations, how the body was positioned, how hair and powder responded to movement, how fragrance lingered between people. Naturalness was a luxury rarely permitted.
The cumulative effect of all these pressures was a quiet, almost imperceptible tension beneath the surface. The body carried strain, the mind carried vigilance, and yet the public only saw composure. Pain, irritation, and fatigue became invisible markers of devotion to the ideal. Those who mastered this balance commanded admiration. Those who failed, even momentarily, faced social consequences. Interestingly, this culture of control extended to the perception of others. Observers were trained to read the slightest deviation from expected presentation. A wrinkle, a slouch, a misplaced curl, each communicated information about discipline, endurance, and competence. Appearance was performance, and performance conveyed authority. There was also a paradoxical intimacy in these routines. Servants and attendants, often young and unseen, knew more about the physical realities beneath the mask than anyone else. They applied creams, brushed wigs, adjusted fabrics, and managed scents, all while remaining silent. Their knowledge was both power and burden, a reminder that maintaining illusion required collective effort. The longer these rituals persisted, the more total they became. Layers of care, concealment, and adaptation multiplied, entwining with each other. Powder thickened, wigs grew taller, scents stronger, creams heavier. Each solution to a problem created new challenges, requiring even more effort and attention. It was an endless cycle, one in which perfection was never truly achieved, only approximated. Ultimately, this system taught a lesson about endurance and identity. Beauty at the French court was never about comfort, health, or ease. It was about control over the self, the perception of others, and the narrative of power. Every ritual, every cosmetic, every careful movement reinforced this truth. By now, the body was not simply a living organism. It was a canvas, a statement, a constant negotiation between nature and expectation. And within this negotiation, the line between survival, status, and obsession blurred. The result was a culture in which physical discomfort and psychological vigilance were normalized, almost invisible, and entirely necessary for maintaining the illusion of perfection. By the time the final chapter of this ritualized beauty journey arrives, it becomes clear that the French royal obsession with appearance was more than cosmetic. It was totalizing. Every element of daily life had been structured to maintain the illusion of perfection, from the powdered face to the elaborately styled wig, from scented gloves to carefully masked fatigue. What began as enhancement had become endurance, and what was meant to impress had become a form of survival. Layers of ritual now dominated existence. Powder hid blemishes, wigs concealed the limits of natural hair, perfumes masked odor,
Creams delayed the visible effects of aging, and controlled posture disguised fatigue and strain. Every gesture, every glance, every breath was calculated to maintain a standard dictated not by comfort or health, but by social expectation. The body had been transformed into a living stage prop, simultaneously visible and invisible, performing continuously for an audience trained to read subtle signals of composure and poise. This constant performance shaped identity. Royals no longer fully experienced their own sensations without filtering them through the lens of what was acceptable to display. Discomfort became background noise, pain was ignored. Even pleasure and spontaneity were measured against the risk of appearing imperfect. Mirrors became arbiters of value. The reflection determined confidence, self-worth, and status, rather than the body's real condition. Psychologically, this created a double life, one living behind the mask, obeying natural rhythms, responding to real needs, the other projected outward, flawless, elegant, controlled. The gap between these selves widened over time, reinforcing a dependence on rituals and objects to maintain a sense of stability. Powder, wigs, perfumes, creams, they were no longer optional. They were necessary tools for survival, weapons against the inexorable passage of time, and shields against social scrutiny.
Yet, for all this effort, perfection remained illusory. Powder settled unevenly, wigs shifted slightly, perfumes mingled unpredictably, and the body inevitably betrayed signs of strain. These imperfections, however, were managed with ever-increasing diligence rather than openly addressed. What mattered was the appearance of control, not the reality of comfort. Each layer of concealment demanded another, creating a cycle both elaborate and exhausting. Servants, attendants, and court physicians played silent but essential roles in maintaining this ecosystem. They applied creams, adjusted wigs, managed scents, and administered treatments, all while remaining invisible witnesses to the labor that went into the illusion. Their presence underscored a fundamental truth. Beauty at court was never solitary. It was collective, systemic, and supported by layers of unseen labor. This culture of endurance had broader consequences. Social interactions, etiquette, and hierarchy were all intertwined with the ability to maintain appearances. Those who faltered, even subtly, risked scrutiny, gossip, and diminished influence. Success was measured not by comfort, strength, or well-being, but by the ability to sustain the illusion over hours, days, and decades. Ultimately, the so-called disgusting beauty of French royalty was less about grotesque substances and more about the totalizing control demanded by social expectation. It required the body to be disciplined, masked, and perpetually managed, transforming human needs into theatrical performance. The rituals, while visually striking and culturally emblematic, were also psychologically consuming, a daily negotiation between survival, vanity, and power. As a historical spectacle, it leaves a fascinating legacy. We can admire the creativity, the artistry, and the intricate systems of control, but we can also recognize the human cost. Layers of powder, wigs, perfumes, and creams were more than adornment. They were strategies of endurance, tools to manage perception, and instruments that shaped identity itself. By the end, the lesson is clear. Beauty at the French royal court was never natural. It was constructed, performed, and maintained at every level, a combination of innovation and obsession. The body, mind, and social expectation intertwined to create a lifestyle that was as psychologically demanding as it was visually magnificent. And so the illusion endured,
flawless in appearance, relentless in practice, and deeply human in its contradictions.